The Third Age, the Age of Restless Spite. No longer was there a single race of elves. The Civil War had wrought divisions that could never be healed. Now, the High Elves of Ulthuan and the Dark Elf exiles were two distinct peoples, united only by their enmity. Malekith's fleet sailed westwards for many weeks, through driving rain, howling wind, and waves like mountains. Ever towards the sunset, Malekith led his people, towards the dark and welcoming night. In the uttermost westward reaches of the Sea of Malice, in the freezing shadows of the jagged iron mountains, the dark arcs of Naggaroth finally halted. There, in that desolate land, Malekith declared he would recreate the glories of Anarion's reign and build a capital to put the greatest cities of Ulthuan to shame. The founding of Naggaroth. The black ark that had once been Malekith's castle beached itself upon the stony shore, fusing with the slate and iron-rich rocks of the foothills bordering the water. The Witch King soon realized if his people were to make a kingdom in the west, they would need a workforce to build it for them. The Dark Elves were warriors all, with no appetite for toil. Knowing that the High Elves would sooner fight to the death than be taken slaves, Dark Elf slaver ships journeyed further east, returning with holds filled with primitive humans who were put to work raising the towers and walls of Malekith's new fortress. The Witch King named this place Naggaroth, and its dark spires towered high over the growing pirate port that nestled in its black shadow. With his capital established, Malekith loosed his armies and fleets on Ulthuan, but Calador once again proved himself the cannier general. Though it took nearly 2,000 years and cost them dear, the High Elves repulsed the invasion. The Dark Elves were driven from what was left of their ancient homeland. Calador did not live long enough to enjoy his victory, however. As the Phoenix King sailed home to Lothian, Morathi called down a storm that scattered his fleet. Calador's vessel was sent far off course. Guided by sorcery, Malekith's pirates swiftly intercepted and boarded the Phoenix King's flagship. Knowing their intent was to capture him and take him as a prize, Calador cast himself into the sea in his full armor, thus escaping Malekith's torturous revenge. The next few centuries saw the Dark Elves focus their efforts inward. New cities were founded and fortresses raised. As Naggaroth healed from the wounds of war, the pleasure cults too grew in popularity, and none so more than those of Cain, Lord of Murder. The fumes from their pyres swathed the cities, and bloodthirsty mobs ran rampant through the streets, killing and maiming with wild abandon. Rather than quell these excesses, Malekith sought to turn this devotion to his own ends. Thus, he proclaimed himself a mortal incarnation of Cain, and soon rejoiced as the cultists flocked to his banner. Meanwhile, in the new world across the oceans, the High Elves were also growing in might. Under Calador II, their colonies prospered as never before, and their friendship with the Dwarfs went from strength to strength. Fearing an alliance between the two races, the Witch King unleashed his Black Ark corsairs. warriors, disguised as warriors of Ulthuan and guided by maps made by Malekith when he was the dwarves' most trusted ally. The raiders wrought havoc upon the merchant convoys. As each fresh atrocity saw stolen wealth flow into the Witch King's coffers, the folk of Ulthuan took the blame for the deeds of their sinister kin. Under this provocation, the High Elves and Dwarves grew ever more distrustful of one another, and finally, propelled by stubbornness on both sides, they went to war. For centuries, the might of Ulthuan and the Dwarves were pitched against each other, both parties little aware of the boundless mirth and celebration this provoked in Naggaroth. As despair and death engulfed the realms of dwarves and the High Elves, the people of the Witch King prospered like never before. Events finally took a turn that Malekith saw as the sign to renew his campaign against Ulthuan. Spies reported that the Phoenix King was departing his homeland to finally oversee the war with the dwarves. Never had Ulthuan been more vulnerable. Its garrisons had been all but stripped of fighters, and its best generals lay dead or had been disgraced. Malekith sent his dark riders to every city in Naggaroth and recalled a greater part of the Naggarothi fleets. Every Black Ark returned to the Sea of Malice, and an army the likes of which had not been seen for 5 centuries was loosed in the cause of invasion. Anlec rebuilt. As the Dark Elf Armada crossed the Sea of Chill, ships from the east brought news of the Phoenix King's death. The Witch King was greatly concerned by this. With the incompetent Calador II ruling Ulthuan, Malekith had been confident of success. Were another king with Calador I's steel chosen, a swift victory would be impossible. Hastened by this news, the Dark Elves landed amongst the ruins of Naggaroth and set about restoring Enerion's great palace of Anlec. With many thousands of slaves laboring beneath the cruel whips of their overseers, ramparts and bastions were swiftly raised around the foundation of the Black Arks. Upon the site of the old throne room, Malekith raised his flag in proclamation that Enerion's heir had returned. As slaves strove to erect a new palace to the Witch King's glory, Malekith threw the might of his army against the sparse defenders of Griffin Gate. Alas, for all the strength of the Dark Elf host, such was the cunning artifice of the fortifications and the resolution of the High Elves, that Malekith's army could not breach the defences. Faced with a rekindled war, the princes of Ulthuan swiftly chose Caradriel, Prince of Evres, as the new king. His first decree was to recall all loyal elves to Ulthuan's defence. As reinforcements rushed back to their homeland, the Phoenix King instituted a system of rotating garrisons that ensured that the fortifications across the Anuli Mountains were always fully defended. The Dark Elves could afford no such luxury, and so were always fatigued and demoralized, while their enemies ever seemed fresh and prepared. The wrath of Tethlis. Caradriel was no soldier, but the war with the dwarves had given rise to many great leaders, and it was to these elves that the Phoenix King gave command of his armies. Of these generals, the most gifted was Prince Tethlis, and it was he who finally routed the Dark Elves from their siege of Griffin Gate. Malekith became incensed when he heard of this defeat and marched to confront Tethlis's host. This time, it was Tethlis' turn to retreat. The Dark Elves advanced without pause, fearing nothing save their master's wrath, and the High Elves fell back in disarray before the massed ranks of Cold One knights and chariots. This sequence of attack and counterattack would be the pattern for many centuries to come. While Tethlis proved unable to drive the Dark Elves from Anlec, the Witch King met with an equal lack of success each time his own armies marched from the Shadowlands. Despite the best efforts of Malekith's assassins to hasten his demise, Caradhrael reigned for just over 6 centuries and ultimately died of old age. Worse still, after Caradhrael's death, Malekith's spies reported that Tethlis had ascended to the Phoenix throne. The Witch King knew this boded ill for his desire to claim Ulthuan. Tethlis had the tenacity and military verve of Calador I, who had thwarted Malekith's ambition so many years before. The Witch King's predictions were soon proved correct. The armies of Tethlis were more disciplined and coordinated than any that had come before. Formerly trained in their towns and cities, these soldiers fought for their homes and out of love for their king. Little by little, the Dark Elves were driven back through the Shadowlands. For all his guile and sorcerous power, there was nothing the Witch King could do to halt the tide of High Elves pouring into Naggaroth. With vexed wrath, he abandoned his beloved Anlec and made for the sanctuary of the Blighted Isle. Left empty, mighty Anlec was destroyed by Tethlis' army, every tower raised from existence by fire and magic. Still not content with driving the Witch King and his armies from the mainland, Tethlis pressed onwards to the Blighted Isle, and there, along its shore, was fought one of the bloodiest battles in Ulthuan's history. Amidst the thrashing of sea creatures and red-flecked waves, the High Elves and Dark Elves hacked at each other with a desperate fury. The Dark Elves fought to protect their final foothold, but the High Elves fought seeking vengeance for their fallen king. In the end, sensing that not even his personal attention could hold back this vengeful advance, Malekith abandoned the Blighted Isle and ordered his fleet back to Naggaroth. Tethlis had reclaimed the Blighted Isle, but he would not live to enjoy his victory. Shortly after, he beheld the Widowmaker at the Shrine of Cain. He perished in that hour, though none can say for certain if his death came at the hands of one of the Witch King's assassins, or those of his own bodyguard, who feared that he would draw the cursed weapon and bring about a new age of darkness. With Tethlis' death, the High Elves' last remaining desire for war was quenched. They had burnt their own lands and seen their people slaughtered. They could stomach no more battle. For his part, the Witch King knew his armies were broken, their fighting spirits spent, and so the Dark Elves returned to Naggaroth to rebuild their strength. Born in blood and the clamour of war, an age of hateful peace descended. Ancient traditions. Dark Elf society is rigidly structured, its titles and positions stemming from the ancient traditions of pre-sundering Naggaroth. New ranks and honours are created only on the rarest occasions, and most of those are abolished at Malekith's decree as soon as he hears of them. For the Witch King to do otherwise would suggest that the royal traditions of Naggaroth were somehow flawed, and if there is one truth closer to Malekith's black heart than any other, it is that the Naggaroth of old was a realm beyond all reproach. This underlying order goes entirely unnoticed by those few outsiders who glimpse the inner workings of Naggaroth. Seeing the constant stream of politicking, disgrace, betrayal, and assassination, they confuse an attack upon the person holding a particular position with an attack upon the position itself. Yet, no Dark Elf wishes to see these ancient titles cast down, for there is no more effective way of measuring one's worth than by reckoning the minions that grovel below and the fools who preen above. Any noble could easily carve out an entirely new fiefdom in the blasted landscape of Naggaroth. That none of them do so is because such achievement would never bestow the same status as rising to high rank in one of the great cities. Worse, it would be taken as an acknowledgement of weakness by those the Dreadlord seeks to call his peers, and weakness is seldom tolerated long in Naggaroth.